So there is this kind of broadcast, this kind of channel, the Wachsmann channel, that we listen to. You know, he was really famous. The Wachsmann channel was very famous in the 50s. 1954, that's the channel. All the radicals of the 60s were watchers of this channel, right? The Metabolist, Super Studio, the French, Germans, the British, all were Wachsmann students, literally the students, in the workshops. Hans Hollein in the workshops. Izuzaki, the Metabolist, all students of the Wachsmann channel. But they didn't have quite the idea that the architect should disappear. They hold on a little bit to the idea of the magical figure of the architect. Wachsmann was more suicidal, right? More like kamikaze, more like, I'm going to take the architect down. So it was like a channel that architects watch. It was a channel about their own destruction. And you could either watch that channel like watching a horror movie and say, I like horror movies. Or you could really go in. And I think it was only after 2020 that for the first time we took the Wachsmann broadcasts serious and we just went in. And we thought that's true, right? That buildings and the architect have given way to another way of being. And of course, the obvious thing is this was happening anyway. It didn't need architects to say, okay, and now, you know, it's kind of crazy. It doesn't make any sense for architects to say, and now we don't need architects. I mean, actually, architects have been irrelevant, you know, at least 100 years. You know, Buckminster Fuller was a professor of poetry at Harvard. He was not professor of architecture. He was not, Fuller was not included in 1932 International Style Show of modern architecture. Why? Because he made modern architecture. Nobody wanted modern architecture to be really modern. I mean, nobody wanted architecture to be like an airplane. So Buckminster Fuller makes a house in 1927, which is so modern. At the center of the house is a television set. The television set is two-way, which means you are in connection with everybody. Same idea, a kind of radical idea about democracy based on the dream of technology and specifically television as a technology. Wachsmann, 1927, the same year, he's making furniture in the middle of Germany for the biggest prefabricated wooden construction company, and he's becoming addicted to this idea of systems and connections, and also the idea that the architect is not really the figure, but a community in the industrialized system. It's a paradox, right? Because we say these people are interesting because they point to the fact that individuals are not interesting.
It is only this what you can repeat is meaningful. And the individual masterpiece is almost the escapade, which one can say, that's very nice, but only one man can have it.
Like imagine if you have an architecture, we don't have architecture schools anymore because we don't have architecture, but imagine you make a kind of historic preservation. You reconstruct the idea of an architecture school and you get a group of people and you say, okay, I want you to pretend to be architects, like thinking about Neanderthals, or just really do sort of a prehistory of the architect. Look at these creatures, strange creatures, mainly men, by the way. So all sorts of problems with this idea of the architect. But there you get this group of people pretending to be men, and you say to them, okay, instead of making a building, can you make the exit of buildings? Could you design the exit? And here I think, to this day, I don't see any images that come close to these Wachsmann clouds from the 1950s, these hangars that could be as big as the planet, and they are, like, let's say the biggest buildings ever made, but they are not buildings. So they're kind of like shadows of building or possibilities of building or potentials for building. I mean, to this, even now, 2038, I think it's amazing. First thing is to try to teach people what a building used to be. I mean, it's really quite difficult to get people to understand advantages, like what it was, what it meant, and so on. Then there's the question of the architect, how to kind of get people to understand the figure of the architect. And looking back on all the records that we have, firstly, architects got to do almost nothing. You know, statistically, architects were engaged in about 1% of the built fabric of the world, so they were never like making buildings, making cities. So, you know, some of them, they got given a few things to do, but that was basically to persuade them to keep talking.
And I read that article here. Whatever happened to this system approach? We haven't heard about it anymore. So, which would actually normally would mean I should better go back where I came from. And then I have here an article which yesterday was a young, nice man who is a journalist, and he asked me some embarrassing questions, and he gave me this magazine, and I found a sentence in which, so you took my coat, can you throw me my eyeglasses? We have to think fast, and we have to switch every minute from one problem into the next problem. For instance, I have also a problem. This is terrible. I need my cue cards on your coat. This headline says, what happened actually to the system approach? And here it says, somebody, GLC house plans will give more, better, cheaper buildings. And then there's one sentence which I think is formidable. The house plans have not been designed around the use of special components, and they can be built using any form of construction. So this kind of characteristic is something worth to laudate. Yeah, so this is something good.
This was a very, very traumatic, and the figure of the architect was very, very interesting, how the architect as a species survived into the 21st century. And we never have fully understood this, and I don't claim to know. But one possibility is simply that the architect was always an unbelievably boring figure. I don't just mean, you know, you talk to an architect and you want to fall asleep. I mean more like architecture itself was a kind of anesthetic against technology. So let's say what they used to call modern architecture in the 1920s was a kind of anesthetic against the revolution of the 19th century of technology. So modern architecture was not modern, was a way of not being too shocked by the fact that everything had already changed.
Now they can pretend as if they are interested in progress in architecture.
I think that in the Wachsmann broadcast, television was not a specific technology. Television was Wachsmann's word for the future. Television was transformation. He said many times, you know, television is shitty. If you watch TV, it's very unimpressive. But he also said we shouldn't be afraid of it, that actually it is the beginnings of another society, another potential. So I think that television was Wachsmann's word for the future. And the future is, by definition, that which you didn't expect.